How's it going?
Pretty good. Yourself?
Pretty good, man.
Nice.
We've got some server code to talk about today. Look at us, front end first, talking about server code, tweeting about server code, arguing about server code. That's all we do these days.
Gonna have to change the name of the podcast.
Third time. It's a charm. You want to talk about... welcome, everybody, front end first. And we are going to be talking about... server code today.
It's server components.
Server components.
Hey, don't worry. It has a name component in it. So it's still...
You know, someone on Twitter was talking about server components and they were saying, I don't even think of them as components. They're like a server template. And I remember thinking about that. Like,
Dude, we had that
exact...
ago. Yeah.
And I was like, yep, I forgot about that thought. And then it was like, it makes things... it makes things make more sense.
Remember we wanted to call them like inert components or something?
Yeah.
The reason we did end up back at components was a good name because they compose with the rest of the React components.
That's right. That's why. Yep. You know, so today we want to talk about this demo that you made. We also want to talk about this thread that we just saw Dan Abramoff tweeting about. And one of the points he makes in that is the interleaving of components. And it's not... It goes beyond the kind of interleaving that we learned about when Next.13 first came out and they talked about doing that. Server components rendering client components that can render server components, because there's like even more that you can do there. So
cool.
Yeah, let's get started with the episode here and talk about a feature that you built in kind of one of our like back office apps that we use for our side projects and for Build UI. And I just used a search feature for the first time today. That was pretty cool.
Nice.
Yeah, it felt good, actually. It was a little slow, but that wasn't the code's fault. But
Sure. Felt good, but it was a little slow.
But it felt really solid, you know, whereas when you use like things that are oftentimes only on the client, it can feel a little finicky. Mm-hmm. You know, the page loads and it feels robust. And then you start typing and you haven't thought about race conditions, pending queries when you update the search term, and all that stuff was like, you can just tell when it's something like that is built well. And it really did feel like that. So good job on that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, React.
So tell me about it. This is a server component app.
Yeah. So I want to learn Next.13, so I converted an app, like you said, back office app, to Next.13 with server components. Probably about probably a while ago, probably like 4 months ago or so.
Oh, wow.
Maybe I don't know. Because when did they come out? They came out in like October, right?
Yeah.
No, this feature I just added.
Okay, this feature just did. Yeah. The conference was in October?
October. So it's probably November. It's like 3 or so months ago. It is an app for like managing our users. So shows a list of users, it fetches them from Firebase, lets us drill into them, do things like reset password, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. There's some other like back office features we use, but we'll stay high level. Anyway, our user list at Build UI has been growing. And so before it was just one giant page, and I would click into it and it would load, over 100 users.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when people email for support,
it's a good problem to have.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. It came out of building it out of a need, because people would email and I would like Command F, type in their email to like find their thing. And I was just like losing place. And sometimes I'd do like people email from like a work email address. So I'd like kind of type their name just to see if like their Gmail shows up. This has happened a few times. So anyway, I wanted to build search.
Nice.
So yeah, so it is a search. It's kind of like, how you would imagine a user search would be. There's a input field. You can type in an email address or a user ID, and it's going to filter the results to, it's like a fuzzy search for if you do an email address, and it's exact match on ID. So we use string IDs. So if you just type in like A, you're not going to get all the users with
an A in their like UUID.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Right.
Because it's like a 32 byte character ID. So you'll get, probably half our users if you type A.
Right.
Anyway. So yeah, because this is a React Server component app, I had to build this search with React Server components, and it was pretty cool. There's a client component and a server component. I guess I'll talk about the client component first. So the client component is a search box. So it is a input, and that has an onChange event. And when it's onChange, just like any React component with an input that has an onChange event, you get to call handle change. And in that handle change, I basically navigate you to a new URL, navigate you to, user list, search equals, whatever you put in that input. And so that, as you type, you're just going to get re-navigated to the next URL. And so that works pretty well. I guess the only problem with that is like, if you type like A, B, C, if you type like A, you just immediately start navigating to the next URL.
You don't have to hit enter or anything.
Yeah. But so like you now get like the loading spinner for the next URL. Mm-hmm. So like the whole screen just clears out from underneath you, which is kind of like a shocking UI thing, right? You like go to type in a search input and like you're re-navigated to a URL, you lose everything on the screen. It's just not like doesn't feel good. So
that's what happens right now.
No, that's what did happen. This is like kind of building up the story. So actually, you know what?
So
before we go into
talk about the loading data part.
Yeah. So let's just say you type in an A and then you navigate to a URL that's like user list search equals A. Mm-hmm. So then that sends just a browser request to your server, and on the server there's a React server component that reads search params, and so I get that A in the React server component.
Hold on. So slow down, because I don't think a lot of people have used server components. Okay. When you first load the page, there's a search box which has all this like the React interactivity you're talking about. Yep. So it has use client at the top.
Yep.
Then you have a table which is showing the users.
Yes.
So how is that? That's a server component?
That's a server component.
And how is that getting the users? It's an async component.
Yeah, it's an async component. So when you first enter this page, there is a React server component. And the very first line of that React server component is await get users.
Okay, cool.
And you can use await in server components just like you would use await in any JavaScript function. So this is a component that returns JSX. But because it's a server component, it can be async.
Okay.
And you can await it.
Nice.
And if you visit the URL, while that await is running, your browser spinner is just loading.
Your browser spinner is loading. Okay, cool.
You can layer in
a loading template.
But I do now.
Okay, got you. Cool.
Yes.
Right.
Let's build it up.
Okay, cool. So that is the server component, fetches the data, returns the JSX over the wire, the flight data gets added. There's no JavaScript running. Like there's JavaScript running, but there's no interactivity. It's not a client component, doesn't have any state, doesn't have any effects, anything like that. And then you have the client component, and you said it sends a browser request to the new URL, which is like the user list search equals. But like you're calling navigate. And so talk through that.
Yeah. So you can almost think of it like, let's just say like outside of React, outside of Next, like you have an onChange event, and you can do like window.location.ref equals, /users search equals, and then whatever data was in that input. So search equals A or search equals Ryan. And then that is it's like kind of like a PHP app. That new URL is going to render a new list of users, right? Because if I just sent you a link,
and the server you want to be able to link to it, and the server component that has that first line await get users also looks and checks to see if there's a search param.
Yeah, exactly. It takes a bunch of options like pagination options and search options and stuff like that. So it can take search equals query params dot search. Right.
And then, but how does it get back up? So you said it sends a browser request. Like, what does that mean? Like,
so imagine
you're not doing like fetch and then like inner HTML.
Correct. So like in a React app without server components, you would do like a fetch request, and then when the fetch request comes back, you would call like set state on
the user list, and it re-renders.
Right, exactly.
But so if you look in the network tab, you would see like a request to the API endpoint, and the response would be like a JSON array of users.
Exactly.
In like
a SPA React app from like 2 years ago.
Right.
Last year.
Right.
2 months
Yesterday.
ago. Yesterday. This navigates you. You could imagine it doing like window.location.ref to a new URL. And that new URL is now going to rerun that server component on the server, read in the search params.
Okay, but that's where it's a little confusing. Yeah, I know we have ants and flies in here. So just welcome to the Build UI office. You say it sends a request, but you can navigate. If you navigate like an on-change handler in a React app, it's not going to just send a request unless you were to do something, right? So is there a document request going out in the network tab? Is it a request to the URL that is Next basically saying, well, we're actually already running the app, and so we don't need the entire initial HTML the way we would if you hit refresh right now. We're just going to get basically it figures out what's changed.
It's that. So Next, you basically say, I want this page. Like, give me render this. Hey, Next app on the server, render this page.
How do you do that?
With Navigate.
You just call Navigate?
Sorry. This is you use router from Next Navigation, and that gives you back two things. That gives you push and replace. And push is like, go to this URL and add history to the browser, and replace is go to this URL but don't add history. So I'm using replace because I don't want you
you don't want the back button to like
for every single
characters.
keystroke. Exactly. But before we even get into that, you can just imagine it's doing like window.location.ref.
Right.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
But what I'm curious about is like if you were to just have like effectively a link component to the about page. I guess it is the same thing because we like code split. I'm still kind of like an SPA mode where you can navigate on the client. You're navigating on the client. So how do you know to rerun that server component and get the new data? How do you know you need to rerun that server component at all?
Oh, okay. So that's
because you're changing the query param.
Yeah.
So how does the server component know to rerun?
So this is like implementation detail of Next.
You don't have to think about it as a developer.
You just say like, send the app to this URL.
Right.
And this URL, it's going to start rendering on the server, and it's going to see, are there server components or client components of this
now,
URL?
What if the user list, didn't relate the search, the await users that filters by the search query? What if you didn't filter? And what if you just navigated to like foo equals bar? Would it rerun the server component and call fetch again?
So there's no fetch from like my code's point of view. There's no fetch. Like I don't have a single
there's no
fetch.
Would it run await get users again?
If I went to foo equals, it would run whatever async component is at /foo/bar.
Gotcha.
So if there was no async component there.
No, I was saying like foo equals bar. So
yes, it would. Yes,
it would run it again. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thing like I had a query param that doesn't change anything about the rendered output.
Yes.
It's still going to run your
cool.
component. Yeah,
That's good.
Yeah.
That's like what you would want. And then if you need to cache something or it doesn't depend, you're doing too many fetches to the database or whatever. That's how like a Rails app would work.
Exactly. Think of it like a Rails PHP
like a Rails
app. Like, okay, you need new data. Well, we're going to go to a new URL.
Right.
So it's just URL based. Like
right.
Go to a new URL.
And a new query param is a new URL.
Yeah, new query param is a new URL.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no same pages. There's no thinking about what's the HTML file for this build or anything like that. So yeah, just like a Rails app.
Yep. Cool. So now you go up to the server component, you get a new list of users based off your query param, and then that re-renders. So now in this app, I do have a loading template. So when you're loading the list of users, there's just a big loading spinner that shows. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, but every single keystroke is going to go to that new URL and then trigger a new list of users to be fetched. So then that async component on the server is running. And because it's running, you're going to see the loading spinner. Yeah. So as soon as you type, like everything gets wiped away and you see a loading spinner. That's a pretty bad user experience because if you want to type Sam, as soon as you type S, boom, loading spinner, search box goes away. So there's a thing called transitions in React 18, and Next 13's router is suspense and transition aware. And what this allows you to do is this allows you to tell the server to start rendering a new URL, but keep the old URL rendered.
Oh.
So if I'm at, let's say I have just the list of users without any search filter, I haven't typed in that text box yet, and then I type like SAM, I'm going to go to the server and I'm going to say, hey, start preparing this page.
Okay.
But the browser is going to keep the old UI rendered until the server responds with the new search. So let's just say there's like 5 seconds to run a search.
Right.
The app, you can see all the data. The app is still interactive. You can imagine you have like a little counter, increase count, count +1. That's setting state.
Right.
That's still all going to work while the server's off generating your search thing, which is really, really cool.
That's awesome.
It feels like you're writing a browser app,
a
server app, in the way that like you can send along like a slow request to a server, but then you're like, I don't want to do that. And you just click another link on the page. Like your server's not like
blocking your UI thread. Or
exactly. Exactly. No, that's it. It's not blocking your UI. Like you can just do whatever you want. So a thing that falls out of this is that you can just you can search for SAM and then you can type like 1 and it's just going to discard the search for Sam and start rendering the new page, SAM1, and you don't have to manage any of that yourself.
That's awesome.
Which is like, it's hard to describe, but
you're eliminating a lot of states from the client. Well, I was going to say, I didn't realize you were going right to transitions right there, because I think even before that, again, I don't think a lot of people have used it yet. And even just what you described, where you render the page, you fetch the data based on whatever is in the URL. And therefore, every time you navigate to a new page, you get that data again. And that's it. And all of the async work's going on the server. So if you don't want to do anything, that's what I meant kind of when I said it feels really robust. Even before you add transitions and keep the old page behind, you can be typing SAM and S and A are discarded. Like
you need the transitions to have you want to discard things if you've typed new input and those results aren't ready yet. So
what happens without transition? Like
you would see the loading template. Like as soon as you
totally.
type it,
but I'm saying, but it's still correct behavior. It's still you don't have a situation where you're not managing 3 in-flight requests because I've typed 3 characters.
Yeah,
you're not even thinking about that.
No, you're not
at all, right?
Right.
And the UI will be consistent.
And if you've worked on
not even eventually consistent, because it's not showing you stale stuff and then updating it. That's kind of what I'm talking about. You see a lot of these kinds of autocomplete, instant searches where you're not like it. So the Rails version of this, I was thinking about like once Next 13 is stable, I think it'd be really instructive for a lot of people to build a Next 13 app directory app with forms and links. That's all you have to start. You don't have on change, right? You pretend you don't have JavaScript. You're just writing a React app. So you'd have an input that you type the query. And then when you hit enter, you're submitting a form with an input that has a named query, and it's a form submission. Mm-hmm. And it's a navigation to the current page that serializes the input with the name. And so that's the same thing as if you were to start on that page, right? And so, because you can do like a GET request to serialize it or whatever, or use the post body or whatever, right? But if you were doing that in Rails, that's what you would do. You have an input and you'd have to submit a form. And
it gets a little, it gets a little tricky because we don't know how Next is going to do mutations. That's like,
yeah, but I'm just saying, let's assume like when you can read the request body, right? In a server component.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is like you would type that in there, you would submit the form, and you'd read the request body so that all your data would be derived from the URL like you've done. Then you get a lot of that stuff for free, right? Mm-hmm. The back and forward button or whatever, and you never are juggling states. Once you have those bones in place, you can upgrade to input on change, and conceptually you're doing the same thing. And because of that, you're never going to have that experience where you type SAM space and all of a sudden your screen updates with 3 different results from a query where they all just get added to the UI. It's like you get kicked off re-render 1, re-render 2, re-render 3, and then you see 1, 2, 3, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like if you have a naive implementation of what you're talking about.
So can I give you an example? Like just like as someone that's like worked on SPAs with these autocomplete things, I might do a search. It's like SAM, and then I have like .then set users results from the fetcher. The only problem is like actually the results for SAM come back first before the results from SA.
That could be the case.
And then you get like...
That's a case where it's inconsistent.
Yeah,
and that definitely does happen. I'm even talking about a case where it's eventually consistent, but this is common where you've kicked off, let's say you debounced it, you took 200 milliseconds in between each character, so you've kicked off 3 effects, like 3 fetches with a .then that have a set state.
Yep.
You're going to see 3 updates, even though from the user's perspective, that's incorrect because the search term now says SAM, and you're going to see a flash of results with S and SA, and then SAM. Right? Happens all the time. I could find that immediately. But it doesn't happen conceptually in like the Rails app because it's a simpler model where the user has to submit it. But then once you upgrade it to on change, Next 13 is doing this for you where you have set off 3 re-renders. It will discard the first 2, even before we get to transitions.
Yes.
Just based on the architecture of server components. That's huge. It will not flash the 3 things because you've now navigated to the 3rd place and it discards the first 2 that are just doing async work, but they're not important anymore.
Yes. Okay.
So that's huge. And I think people, it's hard to understand, but if you use it, then it's very, very easy to see. If you try to build something like this in like a Create React app in a client SPA with React, you basically need like an abort controller. You need a way to cancel the previous thing so that you don't get those state machine, something like that.
Dude.
You don't have to do any of that. All you do is you use the mental model, loading data from the URL, and the fact that the state machine that's in Next 13, the router and everything, it takes care of that for you.
Yeah.
And I think that's awesome.
I think when you say something like, oh, you could use a state machine. Like, yeah, sure. That's a nice approach. When I've had to do this stuff in the past, I'm making a fetch request to get like JSON list of users back and then set state on it.
Yeah.
I have that JSON payload include the search term so that I can do like if search term from JSON
is not the same as what's the state
is equal to what's in the input. Then like I know these are the results I'm interested in.
Exactly.
And like it's just like, by the way, you never start off writing that. It's always because you get a bug report and you're like, oh yeah, I got to add this. So
I think this would be a really cool way to show this off, the router and how it's doing that. Yeah, pretty cool. And then also like, same thing if you were typing and then you decided you wanted to click back to the home link in the sidebar and that server component hadn't finished fetching that new list, doesn't matter. Like it just goes. And you have no like discard. Setting state on unmounted component, right?
Yep.
You're not doing any of that stuff. Like I think it's a really big deal that
there's no like hanging promises anywhere. There's no .thens. Yeah.
No.
Yep.
Yeah. You are locked into these boxes and the router is able to do a lot more for you. You eliminate a lot of these in-between states that are in between the meaningful screens for your user when you build an app like this.
Yeah.
And this is before transit. This is just if you have the most naive UI. And then, the point about, okay, why don't we just show the previous list of users while we're waiting because it's way better. And so how do you actually what does it look like to actually do that in Next 13?
Yeah. So it's really simple. You wrap I'm using replace to basically navigate to this new URL with the search param. You just wrap that in a transition.
Okay.
The way you wrap it in a transition is there's a use transition hook that's in React. Use transition gives you back a function called start transition. And so you call start transition and start transition takes a callback. So it's going to wrap code in a transition. So start transition, open parens, close parens, fat arrow, brace, and then the code that you want to include in your transition in there. So that would be replace to the new URL with the new search param, and then close brace, close paren, closing my transition.
Right.
So you just, it's like, it's always hard. It's always hard to describe callback functions that take callbacks on a podcast. But
no, you have your code, you just indent it and wrap it in a callback.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that callback gets passed to start transition.
Yeah.
Use transition also gives you back a Boolean called is pending.
Okay, cool. And this is where the pending UI comes in.
Right. So now your React component can re-render immediately, know that there's a pending transition going on. So what I do is I show a little loading spinner in the input.
Yeah.
So you know that there's a search going on, but I leave the rest of the page
that's awesome.
rendered as normal.
It felt really, really good, man.
Yeah, it does. It feels solid. And then this is pretty cool. The URL doesn't update until the results come back. So
if you were to hit, let's say you're like running like some really big computation, takes like 15 seconds or something, and you don't care about it. A new chat GPT query, and you want to discard it. You could just click like discard. The URL wouldn't have changed. You wouldn't have pushed anything. The loading spinner would stop. How hard? That would be very hard. You're not going to be canceling any callbacks or using a board controller to stop any of that. Like, I think you could make like 8 solid points here about like what this all the details of the experience and the UI and the UX when you do it kind of like even as a good, you try your best. It'd be pretty awesome. Remember Ember concurrency and remember his original demo showing the code that you have to do to get it to work well, to support cancellation and all of the extra stuff, and then how he adds in the Ember concurrency and starts deleting it.
Yeah,
I vividly remember this diff.
Okay.
You show the code that's required to make it work where you don't see stale results ever, right? Mm-hmm. You can navigate away and not have calling set on an unmounted component or any sort of memory leaks because you didn't clean up. All of that stuff, basically goes away with this, which is pretty dope.
Yeah. Also, too, like you just look at this code and it's simple. I could give this code to you, and I might have to explain like how transitions work because it's your first time using them. But beyond that, like there's no like I'm not managing state, not managing Ajax requests. There's no effects.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It feels great.
No, it's music to my ears.
Yeah.
That's really cool, man. No, it felt really good.
Yeah. Also, too, just the fact that you can search for users on the server, like your database probably has search APIs built into it. You can run search queries.
Right.
Like, just again, like you're adding a search users feature in an SPA. You might be setting up an API route or editing a GraphQL query that now takes search input. And there's none of that because you're just going right to the server and you get to run server code there based off query params.
Yeah.
And that's one thing. That's one area where it's
Rails
like,
101.
Yeah. It's one area where server apps are great. They take an HTTP request and they return a result, and you get to use that in React now, which is amazing.
That's awesome. Very cool. One thing that I thought was interesting was, do you have any loading templates? Do you have any loading.tsx files?
All over the app.
Okay, cool.
So when you first enter this page, like if I were to send you a link, you are not transitioning. I'm sending you a link. Right. You're loading the router to this page. So you would see the loading template, which is a big loading spinner. Right. I can't keep old results around for
there are none.
Right, there are none.
It's the first render.
So you would see a nice UI. Yeah. I have full control over the UI that you see when you're first entering the page, even if there are query params. And then I also have control over the UI that you would see as you're transitioning to a new page, which is I mean, it's awesome. Like you
get to change the experience whether you're doing client-side nav or an original server-side navigation. An initial server-side navigation. Is that what you're saying?
I get to change the experience whether you're going from like result A to result B versus you're entering the page for the first time by clicking a link.
Yeah.
A link. I send you a link in Slack and you click the link.
Right.
You're going to see like a loading template that's nice. And then if you're searching, you keep all the old results around. So I
have a YouTube video where I do this with an email inbox in Next.js and Suspense. And this was like when I was first playing with Suspense. I think it was about a year ago, like beginning of last year, Q1 or whatever, March, something like that. And I suspend the initial app while I'm loading a promise. So I'm loading the data and I render a suspense boundary, give it the promise. And then once I have initial data, I change the root template. So there's no more suspense boundary in the root, so that I can click on email messages and then keep basically them around and don't fall back to that root. So basically add like a nested suspense boundary.
Yeah.
And then that way that one sticks there. And
you can do like
this would be an awesome one to port over to server components and compare the code, because I'll tell you, it'll definitely be a lot simpler. It wasn't even that crazy, but to get it to work, it actually took me a while, because I had to understand what suspense was doing, how to like conditionally render a suspense boundary, which they even had talked about making APIs for, maybe suspend or whatever, and had to deal with the promise, which you await a promise, but
I don't have to deal with it.
You don't deal with it. You don't have to figure out where to put it and how to pass it in anywhere. So that's pretty cool.
It's also pretty good that like
that's pretty cool.
You're not even thinking about like oh, is this the initial render or is it not? You are not thinking about that. You're thinking about, I am transitioning to a new state. When I'm transitioning, I get data. I get like a Boolean that says I'm transitioning. So you can update the UI, but you don't ever have to think about, oh yeah, what does my like initial loading state look like? If you wanted to see that, you reload the page and focus on that side of the UI. So there's no like juggling, like, oh, if I change one, does it affect the other? They're like disconnected, completely disconnected.
I think there's a really interesting like point here, which is when we started building SPAs, we always like complained about having to build two apps. And the way you're talking about it, it's funny because it's like you still have, it feels like there's two apps in a sense. That's not a request response all the way to the server. So you have two user flows through the app. And those are actually the two apps you want to build. The server component that queries data based on the URL and returns list of users is the code you only want to write once. And that was the biggest pain in the ass about building two apps when you go full SPA. So when we were making an Ember app with a Rails API, it sucked because we had to have an Ember app that had all of our business logic querying our Rails API on the server so that we could serve up an OG image to Twitter or HTML to users.
Or even just anything, like could pull data out of a database.
Yeah, exactly. But then you have the client-side navigation, and it truly felt and was two completely separate apps. And you have a client-side data cache identity map that's querying maybe the same API, and you try to share logic, but you run into all sorts of things. And but you wanted the control of the SPA on the client. Yeah. So it just struck me that this is like a very interesting way to think about the fact that you actually do want two ways through an app in the kinds of apps that most people build, in the sense that if you're on Twitter and you click a tweet, you want to show the tweet over the current state of your timeline. But if I send you a link, I don't want my timeline behind it. It's different. So this is kind of it's pretty genius if you think about it, because you're actually able to disentangle the parts that are different and it's the same data, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same data. And so there's one, and you could just fetch it in a component, but now you have this control with suspense and transitions and the ability to use a client component for that kind of thing with like a loading spinner. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
You get to say, okay, what happens if the user's already here and they type another letter? What do we want that user experience to be like? And
exactly.
You actually want two different paradigms for those things, and you have it.
The loading state for I'm initially loading this page, and the loading state for I'm on this page and I'm applying filters.
Yeah.
Like a designer is going to design two different loading states.
Yeah.
Also, too, when we talk about two apps, we often talk about like, okay, so I need to render like the first paint on the server. So there's going to be like, we use Next.js. So there's going to be like get static props or get server side props. And that's going to make a database query. And then kind of thread those results through as props to the page component. But when I've had the page loaded and I click a button like load
refresh
more,
load more.
I don't want to go, I don't want to have my browser like reload. I want to make a fetch request to an API endpoint that then gets new results and adds to it. So you end up writing two apps in the sense that I have ways to load data for the initial props for the page, and then I have ways to load data that like add state to the already rendered state. And this is hard. Like, this is really hard. This is really hard to build apps like that. And with server components, you just have one way. You load data on the server, and if you want to change which data is loaded, you can use transitions, use query params. You get full control over that. But there's one entry point into your data.
Server component. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool. I think, there's a lot here. I think you have to get your hands dirty with it to really understand it, but it's been fun watching you do it.
Yeah. And also too, like just kind of, I heard someone say the best feature of TypeScript is autocomplete. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely truth to that. Like, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I know everyone likes to talk about all these great APIs that TypeScript gives you, but at the end of the day, the fact that I can just start typing and get autocomplete. Yeah. I think one of the best features of these server components is like, I don't have to set up API routes. You know what I mean? I don't have to set up APIs just to pull data, serialize it as JSON, and send it back over the wire. The fact that I can just fetch data. I know it doesn't sound sexy or elegant, but it's awesome to use as a developer.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, we see people spend lots of time trying to figure that stuff out. You're dealing with the re-renders. You're having to consider in your mind what each render frame looks like between the time you start the fetch and what happens if you navigate away or cancel it or change it. And eliminating all those things is huge as a developer.
Yeah.
While also getting the DX of like just await, get users, like you're saying, but it has a side effect of like not only being easier from a developer's perspective, it also makes the app more robust. And again, like you just have to use it. I think it would be pretty cool for us to put together a demo because it just feels solid. You know what I mean?
Yep.
The other point I wanted to make that I thought was interesting was that you didn't render a suspense boundary yourself anywhere, did you?
I do. So for what we're talking about now, I have like experimented with like inline. I call them like inline suspense boundaries. Because Next, like,
insert some kind
of... to answer that question, no, we can go deeper.
Yeah. Next, insert some kind of behind the scenes for you with some conventions if you want to make a loading template, but you do have some that you have rendered. Like if I did a command find in the app, joint app, I would find a suspense boundary.
You would find a few suspense boundaries because just to kind of get into routes, layouts, nested layouts do not run in parallel currently. I don't know if they ever will. I don't know what the thinking there is. Maybe they will, but they don't currently run in parallel. And so if you have your, main layout with like a top header, suspend, the fetch for like the next layout isn't going to run. So I use inline suspense boundaries to like render skeletons.
Gotcha.
Again, there's like a lot of like kind of me experimenting here, but it seems I have been doing that.
Gotcha. Cool. The reason I brought it up was because for this whole experience, you do have a loading template to render for the initial render when you first load the page.
Yep.
And then you have the spinner that you render in the input to show feedback for the N+1 navigations.
Yep.
And you never had to like import suspense from React for that. You're using the conventions of the framework, but you did use transition from React.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting how like they're starting in the middle, not totally abstracting it away with something like a cell from Redwood, which, if you remember from our interview, he has all these cells for like errors and loading. And it's not the opposite, which is we have basically Next 12, where there's like no notion of a loading template you can render while things are happening. You have to do it. You basically do it yourself. And it's somewhere in between where, but it's clear that they want people who are using Next 13 app directory to understand the React primitives, right? So you could say, oh, it's great. I can just render a loading template. You kind of want to know it's suspense. It's nice you don't have to. It's a good drop off point. But to get the transition behavior, you have to you will go to the React docs to see how use transition works, right? And it's just an interesting thing that there's no currently, like you could imagine them adding what would be like the layer up of abstraction around a transition. It would be like a link with like a render prop that says like, transition equals true, and then you get like is transitioning, and then you can just do a little spinner right there, and then you would be reading the docs from link from Next.js as opposed to importing use transition, doing an on click and wrapping it in start transition. So
the React has a bunch of hooks that let you kind of take advantage of all these worlds that are happening in Suspense. So there's like a use deferred value. So if you're transitioning to a new state, you can use deferred value. So you're transitioning to a new state. So you keep your old state rendered.
Yeah.
But you can use deferred value to like see that state that you're transitioning to. I'm not using this in my
search thing.
But you could imagine like
what do you see from it? Like while it's being prepared?
The next state. Yeah. So what's like the state that I'm using while you're being prepared?
Like the route, you could like use router from it, or basically like get the router.search from the feature.
Yeah.
thing.
So yeah, let's say that you would get like the next. Cool. So like the current search results are
Ryan,
for Ryan,
and then
but
Sam.
in the back, but right now I am a loading spinner because I'm searching for Sam.
Yeah.
I haven't done that. I don't know how well this composes with the next thing, but my point is there's a whole bunch of these hooks that are built into React for Suspense that I think we'll be able to take advantage of.
Yeah.
So right. Pretty nice.
Totally. And there, I think it's seen a lot of libraries and frameworks who try to take over too much of it. And then you very quickly feel restricted, and the loading convention doesn't do what you want. And you make so much of a mess around it. And so this is kind of like, it's like we're figuring it out still, which is how Next has always been. When they started, you are using React. We add light abstractions like link, but it's not like, how do I load data in Next.js, right? It's like you kind of just, for a while, there was not a real answer. And then you had like the hooks that like get server side props. But it was just interesting to me because it still feels like kind of their ethos, like that's kind of their take on it. Whereas like, the DHH Rails kind of framework would be like, I want everyone's thing to look the same. But this might be like, oh, we're going to render a loading template. Oh, we're going to render our own suspense boundary right here. I'm going to use a transition. I'm not, right? So there's like, because the space is still evolving so much. Yeah. And because React 18 is new and a lot of people haven't been using React 18 features day to day. So, they've talked like let's say they add the suspense list coordination thing where you are loading your users or you're loading like 3 different statistics and you can coordinate it now with children and like, fade them in or something like that.
Or you have three nested layouts loading data.
Exactly.
And you want to coordinate them so they all fade in at the same time. And, stuff like that. Yeah.
Exactly. You have different panels and you don't want them to pop in like QuickBooks when I open up QuickBooks.com and it's like literally like 8 layout shifts because the graph here loads and it starts animating, but then my invoices, right? That's like, you want to coordinate those. So if they add that, you can already know it's going to be ready in Next right away because in Next you are working with those primitives directly. They're not covering over them with a higher level abstraction.
I think a big thing for me here is like, so the only way you can use this stuff realistically is with Next 13 app directory.
Server components.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see like a couple of frameworks introduce server components, introduce these APIs, like maybe a link component that gives you feedback when it's transitioning, and really figure out like what is like what as an app developer, where am I comfortable? Like where's the best DX they say? For
I think it'd be cool to see like a Create React app that's like server components. Yeah, basically like super vanilla.
Because Next is a big Next. There's a lot. Also, Next makes a lot of like assumptions. Like we want you to build apps like this.
Yeah, there are some opinions in there, but yes,
right. I want to say the Create. We've talked about this where we want to see like the Create React version
Create React app version.
Yeah, sorry.
the crap version. CRAPP.
Yeah, of server components.
Yeah, totally. And then like you can push it to Heroku and just that's what I want to do, and then just see it run every time. And it's not about no images or how do I configure it. It's just it's like basically Rails new git push Heroku or whatever. Fly or whatever, just something very, very simple.
Like what is like an Express app?
No caching, you put a console log in your server component, and it's going to run on the server every time someone hits that URL, or every time someone navigates. And like the Next team's doing a lot of work to make things like parallel requests for nested route. All that I just want to see without any of that stuff.
Next has a router.
Yeah,
using a router. A router isn't a requirement for server
exactly.
components.
Exactly. So. Actually, but probably be better to learn it without it.
Totally.
Your component, your app would render every time, and you would look at the URL and decide which nested server components to render. But that way, you're just running it every time, and you see it's literally a PHP app with a layout, and then you see, we have to determine which server components to render. You're writing a controller parser, right, and choosing which
like
controller.
When you have that one giant index.php.
Totally.
Yeah.
100%.
Express has the ability to like you have a function and you can mount it to a URL. So it'd be great to see this version where like you're mounting like a React app at a URL and I can just walk through each of the steps. Yeah. Yep. And I want to see that ugly I want to see that giant index PHP file because that's how you learn.
That's how you learn the problems that are being solved by
you break it down frameworks. To like basically like what is like the crudest solution so that I can then understand what are these routers giving me? What are these like static site generators giving me? Yes.
Dude, absolutely.
So I would really like to see that for server components.
I think that would be awesome to do that as a single file. What was the there's a lot of apps that are written like this. I mean, people joke about it, but like Peter Levels talks about it. It's like index.php. It's literally like the one file that does everything. There was like big frameworks in PHP like Symfony, and then there was like the smaller ones. What was like the really small one in PHP? That literally was
Code Igniter?
No, it was smaller. Python, there was like Django was the big one. Flask was a small one. So Flask, if you look at it, it's like showing you a single file and rendering different, it's doing routing in there and rendering pages. I think it'd be really cool to do that with server components. Yes. Put logs in them, render 2 routes, see it. And then what I would do is do like a search query / form submission. Read either the URL from the GET request or the request body in the server component, and then render different things based on that, and not use any client components, and understand how you can get data to and from, just like the Remix guys have been talking about. But the point is that those bones you could decorate very easily by turning parts of the component tree into client components. Mm-hmm. But it shouldn't change, because I think what's going to happen is that people are going to reach for what's easy and familiar, which is, I need a client component, use state, right? And to be fair, that's totally expected and natural. But I think it's fine. You obviously want state in the client component to do cool things. There's state under the hood with the loading thing. It's just, you didn't have to do it yourself. But there's going to be many times where you want to use state in client components to augment the experience. But it's important to understand which part should be state and which shouldn't. And if people are trying to sync the data into React state, they're not using the server components as the bones, right? But you want it to be the bones, and you want to derive things from it. So I think there's a nice teaching story there where you can basically enhance it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but I think it'd be really. I think it'd be really good learning for someone who has been building SPAs using effects or fetch or React query or SWR, making a request to API endpoints and then putting that into React state. I think that person would learn a lot from building a server component app with just links to start and then augmenting it.
Yeah. It's interesting that I think
they would notice all the bugs that aren't there anymore with the back forward and the multiple submissions and cancellations and things like that.
Definitely. I think we have over the last few years have optimized for not having to build API servers and stuff like that by using Asura.
Yep.
Gives us GraphQL endpoints for our database, but that stuff, Hasura gives us a lot of stuff. So I'm not saying don't use Hasura, but the benefit of having an automatic GraphQL endpoint for reads, because there's like no mutation story today, but for reads, it kind of goes away because you can just await Prisma query you can just await Prisma query. So I don't need something that my browser can make fetch requests to that then talks to a database and then returns the results back to the browser.
Yep.
And I think that's, really nice. And I kind of feel like we're going to end up
with Prisma on a local database.
Yeah, I think
what's interesting to think about is the stuff that it does give you permissions.
Yeah, exactly.
And the aggregates, as simple as it is, it saves you time. Like
for sure.
It would be curious to see. Does your the app we were talking about? It's called App Joint. It's like a joint. It's like an aggregator for apps and setting up auth with Hasura and a Firebase. And does it use Prisma?
No.
What does it use? Hasura?
Hasura.
Okay. Hasura. I was going to say, I'd be really curious to see an app like that has CRUD. It's a CRUD app.
Yeah.
If you were to convert the code into Prisma code, what would the diff be?
So it would be, again,
there'd
because
be more
Hasura
code.
gives us so
Permissions,
much. Yeah, the permissions would
search.
be more. Yep.
You'd have, but Prisma has a search.
Yeah, Prisma has search. Permissions. I think Prisma has some cool permission stuff, but I
think
that would be a lot.
Have you written a lot of Prisma code?
Yeah. Okay. My other Next.13 app that we talked about, the Stable Diffusion front end, is Prisma.
Okay.
Again, it's hard to talk about this right now because there's no mutation.
Yeah.
So the mutation stuff is just ugly and brittle. For the reads, it's nice. It's just nice to be able to say await query database,
right?
And then
it's nicer.
Start rendering.
It's nicer. It's nicer than doing a GraphQL request because of TypeScript and because you don't have the service.
There's no
like another thing
in a client side SPA.
But what
React
about like
app, you have to render to fetch, so you always have those frames you have to deal with.
Yeah, but you could query Hasura from your server component.
Yeah, that's what I do in this.
Yeah. So I'm just, this is like another conversation for another day, but it's the difference between querying Hasura in your server component and querying Prisma. So you still don't have the frame on the client.
Yes.
So that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, we treat Hasura like it's our database ORM.
Yeah.
So we're not writing a lot of custom code. We treat it like we're sending it a query and we're expecting results back.
Yeah.
But I think part of the reason we do that and we went to these tools.
It's made for the client.
Exactly.
No, for sure.
Exactly.
But the things we would lose, there's a convenience with the Prisma and the local DB for sure.
Yes.
There's like more precedent there for things like testing or whatever. But then, migrations, it's fine. But like that kind of thing we're doing again, which those are, I'm just trying to bullet point the things that Hasura still gives you in that case where you're using them both on the server.
So the biggest thing I've been surprised by is auth. Like you got like a GUI for this user doesn't have access to these rows. This user does, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
And that's stuff that usually ends up in code that you write, and then you have to write tests for it, and then it's just a mess. And So,
cool.
Yeah, I'm not talking about getting rid of Hasura tomorrow, but I think a lot of
it would be if you had to choose tomorrow or whatever. You probably try Prisma, just more out of curiosity.
Again, I'm going to withhold here because I need to see how mutations work.
Right.
Because right now it's like if you're building a read-only app, Prisma in Next.13 is great, but as soon as you have to write, this isn't a knock against Prisma. It's just there's no mutation story today. It's coming. It'll be there in the future. It'd be nicer to be able.
You're saying you could just send a GraphQL request to Hasura because they already have mutations defined.
Because Hasura has
mutations defined. So you would just send a fetch request from the client?
Yeah, that's what I do.
Whereas with Prisma, you would have to send a request to a new API route that you would have to write.
Yeah.
And
And this is nothing. This is out of Prisma's control. And Next.13 is going to add mutations.
Yeah, Sebastian just tweeted this RFC, not RFC, like a proof of concept or a PR to React with like the ability to call a function. So that would be a situation where you're in the component, you want to save a query, you have your search and you click save and it's like on click equals, and then like you're running a server function.
I mean, that's the dream. That's the dream.
Then you're writing like Prisma code there.
Yeah, that's the dream.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
I think you would import the function from another file,
or it could be action like the Remix style where you have like a local function, something like that, and you're just running server code.
Remix has a really good
like
answer.
What you want. Yeah.
Remix has a really good answer.
If you were writing Remix, you would use Prisma, not Hasura.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still things you get with Hasura, but it's you don't have that cost. Like that downside is not there.
Yeah, I also feel like a lot of people in the Remix like ecosystem use Prisma, use local database, don't do any client side data fetching. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's almost like a badge of pride in Remix to only fetch data on the server. Mm-hmm. So like I think I would just naturally be like, okay, let's do it like that.
No, but you could still fetch data. I'm not talking about fetching.
I know.
Yeah. I know. You're just saying no. It's more about the local. Like it's just Hasura services like Hasura are best. They really evolved out of solving the problem of not wanting to write API endpoints for client queries. So now this is like not that same problem space anymore.
Right. Yeah. Or at least for sure that's why like we got involved with it. Right. So
that's the benefit for us.
Yeah. And it feels like a lot of that melts away. Yeah. So
cool, exciting. Man. Well, I'm interested to see where this all goes. I still like writing SPAs. The jury's still out for me in terms of what stack is like my favorite and most productive, and feel like I can really pull off the nicest. But I think this is things like transitions.
Do OG tags. Just do OG tags in your SPA. Seriously. It's silly, but there are some nice, we can talk about this for a quick thing, but there are some nice answers to like OG images and stuff where you dynamically generate them at runtime. That's why you need server rendering. That's why you need data fetching on the server, because you need to have initial HTML that's right for bots and search engines. And that's where that just kills the SPA.
That's where we came in, because we have a media site. What I want to do is like once I get familiar with like the interleaving components, I think for like my style of app and like side project and stuff, that's going to be the most interesting part for me. The way the calendar comes up in my fitness app and that doesn't change the URL, but I want to fetch the days and the events that you worked out on a server component, put it in a client component that raises up. And I think you can make that feel just as good, even though, and it renders the instant loading template for the suspending server component in the modal as it's sliding up. Like I did all that stuff in my app just because when I was learning Suspense, and it's really conceptually easy to pull that off in an SPA because you're there and you just know everything, right? This guy Rauna who works at Vercel has like such a kick-ass homepage, and I think that would be another example that I'd like to see in like a server component architecture where his different projects, they're being fetched, so they're fetched from a server component. Like build his app, but you don't get to call fetch on the client, right? So everything fetches, but there's a lot of interleaving going on because you want to fade the things in.
I'm gonna like, I know this isn't like the official messaging, but I fetch data in the top level server components, and then I just thread it through client components. I don't interleave and okay, so maybe that's all you need to do. But I'm saying you're gonna have servers and clients and servers in an app like this. You have to, because I don't think so.
No, you sure do. Because he has like persistent UI and like nested, right? So it's like a nested router. Like
you're saying you want to click a button, toggle some state, and that should now render server component.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can do that. I don't like.
You haven't done it yet.
Yeah, and honestly, like the way I approach apps is like very like from like the Ember days, very like URL driven.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Like, well, he has URLs. It's just a very dynamic UI. I just want to see what it's like, where you're nudged to, and what kinds of I'm pretty sure, based on my obsession with following very closely like what people on the React team do and how they're thinking about. I mean, they're talking about using Suspense for animations, right? So they've thought about, basically they're trying to cover every use case. Like They are. So what I'm saying is like, I want to make sure, I'm just curious how far you can push these things and not feel limited, because that's not something I like as a developer. I think a lot of people don't like it. I think it's why a lot of people started writing more client-heavy apps, is because they felt limited by, whatever the tools like Rails gave them when their PMs asked them to build, sortable whatevers and this and that. So I'm
going to say two things here. So first, from what I've seen in server components and your fitness app, there's nothing that you're going to be limited by.
Yeah.
You'll be able to do everything. Only fetching data on the server.
Except for mutations.
Except for mutations. Can't change any data. You can read data.
Yeah, like when you tap that thing and it's pulsing while it goes and then it reloads, like, is that going to be a server component?
So we need to, I can't give you an answer because there's no mutation. So I have to see what the mutation story is. But it should be. Like in my mind, you absolutely, can build that, and it should be a server component and it should have one way to fetch, and you should be able to transition between the old version and the new version, whatever it is, right? Okay, so just two responses to that. So first is, from what I've seen of server components, and I know your app, your fitness app that has all these
little
UI, you're not going to run into any issues. Now, there's no mutation, but since there's no mutation, you can do that all client side. Right. So like that, that you're already doing everything client side today. So.
I know, but I don't, you're outside the paradigm at that point. Like I get, today it's fine.
Sure.
I'm thinking about the end state.
Sure. So
it's like you said, if people are fetching data, not in a server component, like it's kind of like, why do they, you should be able to do that.
So I guess I would be surprised.
Yeah, I would be too.
So but again, I'm going to just withhold until we see that. The second thing is, I think like for 98% of apps, you're going to fetch data at the top.
Yeah,
and pass it down.
Yeah.
And you're going to have one or two cases where you have a modal that pops up that needs to fetch data without changing the URL. And you'll turn that inner piece of that modal into a server component, and that will fetch its data whenever it gets rendered. For things like that. But for most apps, like, I know like everyone wants to talk about interleaving and all that. Yeah. And I know that's like how you build every single UI, but like you're going to look at it like a Rails controller. You're going to fetch in the controller and then pass data to the view, and the view is going to use JSX to render it. And it's awesome.
It is awesome. We do need to wrap up here, but I'm curious, like, if you're doing that, why not just use a loader like the way Remix has it, if that's all you're using?
So I think from a developer, if you told me I had to use Remix, I would say, okay.
Yeah.
Like I would be, from a developer, like I look at,
both things are what you want.
I know
you want
people
to load
get
data
so
and
in
then
the details.
Tied to a URL.
Yeah.
But like, I guess if that's how you're writing, what other benefits besides being able to load data easily that's tied to a URL have you seen so far from server components? If most of your server well, this is fun because there's a lot to explore, and this is very it's new territory. But I'm just curious.
You can conditionally, so you can have a server component that imports child components, that renders, that interleaves with server components. Right. So you can decide when, like, each of these components as a render can fetch data.
Have you done that?
No,
that's what I'm saying. You personally.
No, I haven't.
All your server components basically look like await and then render client component with props equals, like literally just one component. Like the server component returns one.
No. I only split off into a client component when I need React state, but all of them do look like await, load data, return, JSX, HTML template. And I think that's
but it's not just like one client component. Then you go to town.
No. I do everything on the server until I need state. And then it's like, okay, what parts of this interaction
and that
are
feels pretty good. Like,
sometimes I don't like creating a new file.
Right.
That's one of the things I loved about React is you can just, new function at the bottom of the file. Yeah. So sometimes you have to come up with a name.
Yep.
I have a lot of your button, like I click a button, it toggles state to show a modal.
Right.
So that whole button now needs to be in a client component because there's state associated with it. Right. But it's worth it.
Yep. Cool.
Okay. I'll stop.
All right. We got to stop. This is a lot of fun though. I can't wait to start playing with it. Honestly, I've just been waiting. Because If I see a random build error that fixes when I refresh the page and I know it's not my fault, peace out, homie. I'll see you in 3 months. I'm not a young chicken anymore, spring chicken. I ain't got time for that. So I'll see you in 3 months. But hopefully it stabilizes soon. I can get cracking at it. Awesome, man. Dude, thanks for sharing all your experience. It's been fun hearing about it. It's cool. You go off and do all these cool things. And I'm like, whoa, that's crazy. Pretty cool, though, man. Pretty cool. All right. I guess we're going to wrap it for this week. Look at us. What is it, 3 weeks in a row? Killing it.
Hell yeah.
That's it for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Bye.